Good morning, class. So this is our second lesson, PowerPoint lesson for the ecology unit. So the last lesson basically was based on the geochemical cycling of matter through the different spheres of the Earth, the lithosphere, the hydrosphere, atmosphere, and the biosphere. So we're going to talk a little bit more about the biosphere today and the energy flow within different systems of the biosphere. We're going to be talking about or going over some terminology that you've probably all heard of before many times. For example, we're going to be looking into photosynthesis today. We're going to be looking at food webs, food chains, trophic levels and efficiency, and looking into how energy is transferred between different levels of organization. So first of all, I'd like to talk a little bit about the sun. And as you know, that all of the energy basically comes from the sun. And there are basically nuclear reactions that take place within the sun. And this energy from the sun is given off by these nuclear reactions. And some of the organisms in the biosphere basically trap that solar energy and use this energy to make food, which is then used by all organisms, all within the biosphere, to be able to do the things that they do. So all types of activity, including growing and reproducing, moving. Whatever the organism is meant to do, it is because of the fact that it is gaining energy from essentially from the sun. So the sun is a source of light energy, heat energy. It is the source of evaporation, which produces precipitation, and it is a source of photosynthesis. So 30% of the total energy from the sun is reflected by clouds or the Earth's surface. 44 is trapped within the atmosphere. Percent of it is trapped within the atmosphere of the Earth. 25% basically heats and evaporates water from the bodies of water on Earth. And 1% of it is wind, and 0.23% 0.023%, counts for the photosynthesis. So not a lot of the energy is used for the biosphere in terms of photosynthesis, but that's enough in order to sustain life. So energy flow through the ecosystem. So sunlight, again, the main energy source for life on Earth. Without this energy from the sun, life on Earth, as you know it, would not exist. 1% of the sun's energy is used by organisms that are basically capable of photosynthesis. So all of the sun's energy that reaches the Earth, out of all of the sun's energy that reaches the Earth, only less than 1% is actually used by living organisms during this process known as photosynthesis. And this process known as photosynthesis is used mostly by green plants and a few other organisms, including certain photosynthetic algae and photosynthetic bacteria. And it is basically where the light energy from the sun is used in addition to other abiotic factors, so non-living factors that convert this light energy into glucose and oxygen. So Yeah, so we're going to go into that in a bit more detail, but the sun, the nuclear reactions in the sun are the energy source for almost all life on Earth. And although a small amount of the sun's energy reaches the surface of the Earth, this is just enough to be able to warm the Earth's atmosphere and make it habitable and life-sustaining. The conversion of the solar energy into chemical energy in the form of food is important for two reasons. First of all, the sun will continue to supply the Earth with energy for sustaining life for billions of years. Yet we have approximately 5 billion years to go before it becomes, I believe, a red dwarf. Many organisms on Earth contain chlorophyll, which is basically that green pigment that gives plants and trees their green color, which allows the biosphere, organisms, the living organisms within the Earth, to harvest some of this reliable solar energy. So photosynthesis, again, is the process by which energy from the sun is converted by plants and certain algae and bacteria into chemical energy. The term photo is basically those photo and synthesis basically come from the words photo, Greek, I believe, Greek words meaning light, and synthesis meaning putting together. So, and chlorophyll is the pigment within those plants that is responsible for photosynthesis, putting together essentially the carbon, the hydrogen, and the oxygen, and bringing those three elements together in a specific way in which a sugar molecule, or also known as glucose, is produced. And glucose is considered the universal energy carrier molecule. And glucose is found within our cells. And it is what is converted into energy within our cells to allow our cells to do the function that they are meant to do. So for example, if we are talking about muscle cells, they will allow muscle cells to do what they need to do so that our muscles will contract and relax and allow for movement. Nerve cells, the glucose allows for provides the energy for those nerve cells to be able to transmit information back and forth from the different parts of the body to the brain and the spinal cord to coordinate certain reactions. Glucose is again a sugar molecule, and it comes into the category of biologically important molecules called carbohydrates. There are a few different molecules that are very important for all living things. Carbohydrates is one of them. Proteins, lipids, and nucleic acids are the fourth category, but glucose comes under carbohydrates. And glucose, again, is required as an energy supply for the plants that produce it. So plants, even though they produce the glucose, they themselves need the glucose within their cells to be able to produce more glucose and allow for other organisms that consume plants to gain the energy that they require. Therefore, plants need a continuous supply of those three elements: carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And basically plants get the hydrogen from the water from roots, and the carbon and the oxygen, if you see here, this is a cross-section of a leaf. The carbon dioxide enters the leaf through the external atmosphere through these two cells, and these are specifically they're called guard cells, and they create this opening called a stomata. Okay, they're tiny pores that allow oxygen out and carbon dioxide in. Okay, and so carbon dioxide is required to produce glucose by plants. Oops. So photosynthesis is an actual chemical reaction, and it is written as this equation, and this is what is known as a balanced equation. You will learn this in grade 10 chemistry, in which when we are putting numbers, like for example the 6 in front of the carbon dioxide and the 6 in front of the hydrogen, this is known as a balanced reaction, because the law of conservation of matter states that matter cannot be created nor can it be destroyed. It's just converted. So these things are converted into new products, but it's exactly the same matter. So you start off with 6 carbon. This glucose molecule has 6 carbon. You have 6 times 2 hydrogen, you have which is 12, and then you have 12 hydrogen in the product. So that's why there's coefficients in front of those reactants, and there's a coefficient of 6 in front of the oxygen as well. If you add up all the atoms on this side, you get the same number of atoms, exactly the same type of atom on the other side. So reactants versus products. And this is carbon dioxide plus water, and the sunlight, the energy creates glucose and oxygen. And this is a very simple photosynthesis equation. The photosynthesis actually happens in many enzyme catalyzed reactions that take place within the chloroplasts of plant cells. And you will learn more about these in grade 11 and grade 12 biology. They've got very specific chain of reactions that take place for photosynthesis to happen. And we don't cover that in grade 9, but this is just a simplified version. So again, photosynthesis, the water is absorbed through the root system. Water is needed. Water, carbon dioxide comes and enters through the stomata on the bottom, under the bottom of the leaf, and the leaf's epidermis and the cuticle. And the carbon dioxide and water and the sunlight combine to make the sugar. And the sugar is basically transported across the plant through what is known as the phloem. But you will learn about that more. You've probably already heard about these phloem and the xylem before. But so excess water and oxygen will leave the plants through a process called transpiration. And we talked about that in the last lesson. But that's just a simplified diagram of photosynthesis. So in addition to glucose, photosynthesis continuously adds vital oxygen to the Earth's atmosphere, while that same process removes carbon dioxide. And the carbon dioxide that's actually released from photosynthesis as a byproduct is used during another very vital chemical reaction or chemical process known as cellular respiration. We're going to talk about that next lesson. Not all parts of the biosphere produce oxygen at the same rate and in the same amount. For example, the oceans and the tropical rainforests are the primary sources of oxygen. They account for, tropical rainforests account for 30% of the Earth's photosynthesis, and the oceans are responsible for another 30%. And within aquatic ecosystems, photosynthesis is mostly performed by algae and chlorophyll containing microscopic organisms such as plankton. This is an example of a plankton. You know that the baleen whales are that consume large amounts of plankton through their baleen. So basically, trophic levels are when we're talking about photosynthesis and energy carrier molecules being produced, there's consumption that happens within from one organism to another. We talk about a term called trophic level, and basically it's just a way in which living things are categorized according to how they gain energy. Okay, so the bulk of the energy is within the first, within this category known as the primary producer. So an organism is placed in a trophic level based on how it receives its energy. So primary producers receive the energy from the sunlight. These are the ones that are doing the photosynthesis. Without the primary producers, the sun's energy would not be able to be converted into usable energy for the rest of the ecosystems. And then, so these are the photosynthesizers. These are the ones that are making the energy, and using the carbon dioxide and producing the oxygen. Then you have the next energy level, with a trophic level, that includes primary consumers. And these are the first level consumers. They feed exclusively on the producers. And they're also known as heterotrophs. They're basically herbivores. And so they're primary consumers. They eat the plants, or the photosynthetic plants, yeah. And then, so a lot of energy, as you see, is lost, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. And then this second, this part of the pyramid at the bottom, actually this pyramid can be reversed, and it would mean the exact same thing. The secondary consumers would always be at the top or the bottom of the pyramid, depending on how you're looking at it, but they feed off of the primary consumers. And there's a lot fewer secondary consumers compared to primary consumers, and there's a lot fewer primary consumers compared to primary producers. So trophic levels are helpful because they allow us to group organisms based on their eating habits and define each step of the food chain. So the first trophic level basically contains organisms that are able to make their own food from those abiotic factors. So from sunlight, soil, water, and other nutrients like carbon dioxide. These are the plants. Okay, they're called primary producers, or they're called autotrophs. That means auto means self. They can make their own food. The second trophic level includes contains organisms that will feed on the primary producers. So they rely directly on the producers for their energy source. They can't make their own energy. They have to eat the plants to gain energy. And these include the herbivores, and they're also known as primary consumers, and they're also known as heterotrophs. So they have a number of different terms that you can call these organisms or animals at the second trophic level. So herbivores, heterotrophs, and primary consumers. Third trophic level includes organisms that rely on primary consumers as their main energy source. So you can see here, this little fox, it's got a bunny in its mouth, and the bunny was the primary consumer, or the heterotroph. It only eats plants. And this is going to be a secondary consumer. So these will eat the primary consumers. And then there are other trophic levels. The fourth trophic level, we'll talk about that later. But then there's also these decomposers, and they basically are connected to each of those trophic levels. They're organisms that feed on the waste from biotic factors, including the dead remains of like feces of these organisms and the dead remains of organisms. Okay, so and they basically when they decompose that material, they will return eventually those nutrients, which are eventually become the abiotic factors, like the nutrients like phosphorus and nitrogen and carbon, and they will return those nutrients into the ecosystem so that they can be basically uptaken by those plants again. Matter moves through the biosphere by traveling from one trophic level to the next within a cycle. So you can see here the sun's energy is used by the producers at the first trophic level. These are the green plants, for example, not just the green plants, but mostly green plants. And then the green plants are consumed by the primary consumers within the second trophic level. These are also known as the herbivores or the heterotrophs. And then that will eventually, when this vole, for example, dies, it will become nutrients for the decomposers. And you notice that all of these arrows, there is another arrow connected to that arrow whereby heat is released. So there's wasted energy. Not all the energy from the green plants gets to that vole. Some of it is lost as heat. And some of this energy from the vole to the short-tailed weasel is also lost as heat. And here and here and here, it's the same for each trophic level. And then so the short-tailed weasel is considered a secondary consumer. It's a carnivore. It will feed off of the vole. And then you've got the fourth trophic level, which is another carnivore. It's a tertiary consumer. It's called a tertiary consumer. And it will feed off of that secondary consumer. And then once it dies, it will return into the earth eventually, because of the fact that these decomposers will decompose it to return the nutrients back into the soil for the plants again. So this is some terminology review. So again, herbivores, organisms that eat plants only, for example, grasshoppers. Omnivores are actually organisms that eat both plants and animals. So for example, certain types of birds will eat seeds, and they will eat plant seeds, and they will eat worms and like other insects, for example. Those are examples of omnivores. And then you have larger creatures like even bears that will eat both plants and animals. I'm sorry, I forgot to finish this slide here. Carnivore is an organism that only eats animals. For example, in this, well, not in this one, but this is an owl, and this is going to be, and the snake, they're both going to be carnivores. Another example would be of a hawk. So all levels of a food chain are directly, even though it doesn't look like, they're all directly linked to the decomposers, which ultimately again move the nutrients from the decaying bodies and waste of producers back into the abiotic parts of the ecosystem, as they themselves take the nutrients in order to survive. They decompose, and when they decompose, they are requiring nutrients they themselves need to grow and reproduce and do whatever they need to do. So food chains, basically it's a step-by-step sequence linking organisms that feed on each other. And you see the arrows basically show the direction of the flow of energy. So the producer right over here is uses the sunlight to grow, and the primary consumer basically is what eats the producer, and so forth. This really does not exist in nature. It's not a very linear type of simple relationship like this. These are examples of food chains, but they're not always just so simple and linear. Food webs are more realistic in nature. Each organism has a variety of food sources, and this is something, it's an evolutionary thing. You don't want organisms just relying on one food source, because that you wipe out one food source, you wipe out that organism that relies on that single food source. So therefore, multiple food chains exist. These food chains interlock to form a complex food web, and basically a food web is a representation of the complex feeding relationships within ecosystems. So this is an example of one. So plants are eaten by all these different types of this is a herbivorous insect, eats only plants. Seed-eating birds and mice and squirrels, they all eat the plants. And then the rabbits can either be eaten by the fox or the hawks. And you've got the insects eaten by spiders, or predaceous insects, or insectivorous birds, or directly by snakes. Okay, and this just shows you one example of a food web. There's so many different ones. This is an example of a trophic efficiency pyramid. Okay, what is an energy, it's also called an energy pyramid, and it shows the amount of available energy for each trophic level. So again, this is similar to the one that I showed you earlier in the PowerPoint, showing you that the bottom, actually the one that I showed you was reversed, but it was the same thing, whereas the largest section included the primary producers. So this is an aquatic energy pyramid, and these are phytoplankton and seaweed. These are primary producers. There's photosynthetic organisms that will provide zooplankton and certain other types of aquatic organisms that are primary consumers. They're herbivorous consumers specifically, which will then, there will be less of them compared to how many primary producers, because at every trophic level, there's heat energy lost, and there's energy that is wasted. So only 10% of that available energy, for example, from the primary producers that are being consumed, is transferred to the next level, and so forth and so forth. So every single time, there's 10% only available to the next energy level. So that's why you're going to have very few top consumers, because by the time you get up here, energy is lost all the way. So there's going to be a lot less energy left over for these top carnivores. So there's going to be obviously less carnivores. And each of these is connected again to the decomposers that transfer the nutrients back so that the primary producers can, produce more food. So again, the trophic efficiency is a measure of how much energy an organism at one trophic level is transferred to the next. And I'll show you again. This is another example of a food pyramid. It's called a hypothetical biomass pyramid. And the term biomass is important here. It's basically the total mass of living organisms in a defined group or area. And the trophic efficiency here is how it shows how inefficient the energy is being transferred from basically the biomass here to the next level, to the next level, to the next level. So trophic efficiencies are usually quite inefficient, again 10%. So this is 1 million kilograms in terms of the primary producers, the phytoplankton. From this bottom of the pyramid, 10% is transferred to the next level. So only 100,000 kgs of herbivores, and then 10,000, that's another 10% loss, and then 1,000, and finally 100 kilograms to the carnivorous sharks. So every level there's a 10% loss. Transfer. And in on page 25 of your textbook, there's another food pyramid. Figure 1.16 shows another example of food pyramid, showing the energy that is stored in the biomass at the one trophic level, which moves to the next from grass to jackrabbit, long-tail weasel, and finally to a great horned owl. So you should take a look at that. That's on page 25 of your textbook. So energy is lost as heat at every single level. And another reason why there's energy loss is because not everything is eaten. So when you have so there's several reasons why biomass decreases from one trophic level to the next. The herbivores that are eating the plants might not eat all the parts of the plant, so some of that is going to be lost or wasted. So some will eat only the leaves, some will eat only the roots. So not everything that is eaten is digested. So, for example, the energy that if we're talking about a bunny, for example, when a carnivore, a secondary consumer eats a bunny, that fur, that energy that went into making the fur is going to be lost, because the carnivore, the secondary consumer, is not going to eat the fur. It's going to leave the fur and it's going to eat some of the meat, and the rest of it is going to be wasted. So that's why some of that energy is wasted. And also at every energy level, energy is lost as a heat from the bodies of organisms. So because of this inefficiency of energy transfer from the bottom of the pyramid to the top, finally the top, there's usually fewer carnivores than herbivores, and there's fewer herbivores than actual producers. So fewer of these compared to producers. And so that is the end of this lesson. We're going to talk about bioaccumulation in the next lesson, along with cellular respiration. Bioaccumulation, you know what, I'm gonna talk about that in the next lesson. So I'm gonna send you this PowerPoint video lesson along with a PowerPoint, and I'm gonna send you some reading and some homework for you to do to make sure that you've got this. Have a wonderful day, students. My class, take care.